I don't like saying that. I wish that we were at a point where we're actually debating things that we could improve in our healthcare system. And anyone in either party would, if they're honest, would admit that there are things we should improve. But what we should not do is repeal the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And then to call that repeal a health care bill when you're ripping away health care by one estimate from 24 million people as of the last version of the bill, which, as you know, was the more, quote, moderate, unquote, version of the bill. The bill moved to the right, so God only knows, and maybe CBO knows, whether that 24 million has grown. So this is a tax cut bill that's misleading people to believe that somehow it's a health care bill. Second, what this legislation would do to Medicaid is an abomination. It's an insult to the American people. We have to fight like hell to stop them from decimating Medicaid. And there is no question about it that that is what they're trying to do. And I think it's just beginning to dawn on folks the impact of what they would do on Medicaid. They're trying to do two things. Both are destructive. First, to wind down, to undermine, and ultimately end the Medicaid expansion. That's what they do in the current version of the bill. The second thing they're trying to do is to put a per capita provision on Medicaid, which means that for the first time in more than 50 years, the guarantee of Medicaid goes away, okay? So don't tell me that decimating Medicaid is part of a health care bill or part of a health reform bill. That's why I call it a tax cut bill for the super rich. So this is a transfer of dollars in the most pernicious but obvious ways. A transfer of dollars from the Medicaid program to the super rich. We were told that the last version of the bill that the top 400 Americans got $7 million each. That is wrong to do in any bill, let alone a bill that they claim is a health care bill. Okay, so I'm just going to set the table for what we're here to talk about today. You probably thought I wouldn't get to it. But today we're talking about the impact of this legislation, not just on Medicaid itself, but on Medicaid as it relates to kids in our schools. Here are some numbers that you should know about. Here's some basic numbers on that. When you consider both the federal and state share of Medicaid together, schools receive nearly $4 billion in Medicaid supports as of 2015. In my home state of Pennsylvania, that number is about $135 million. So these are big numbers just on kids in our schools with regard to Medicaid. So when that 13-member ad hoc body in the Senate, whatever they're calling those Republican senators who are meeting behind closed doors, last time we checked it was all men, by the way, but when they come out with their proposal, I hope that's among the first questions we ask. What about kids with disabilities? What about kids in our schools that need basic protections and the basic help that Medicaid provides them? We're going to ask those questions when that bill comes out. Because here's what we're concerned about. We're concerned about special education services. We're concerned about health screenings. And we're also concerned about early intervention in pre-K programs. So all of those issues, all of those concerns are at risk with what they're trying to do here in the Senate. We already know how bad it was in the House, how bad that bill was, what an insult that bill was to the American people. But we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to hold the Senate accountable as well. So I'm going to stop talking because I'm going to get madder the longer I talk. So I'm going to hand it over to someone that you should hear from, someone who has served her state as the governor of her state, the governor of New Hampshire, and now serves with distinction as the junior senator from New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan.
Yay, Maggie. Thank you, Maggie. Well, my thanks, first of all, to Senator Casey for his leadership and his passion about health care, his understanding of some of the challenges that families with disabilities face, and for his convening of this press conference here today. I also want to thank the families and the educators who are here today. Look, I approach issues of education and health care as a senator, yes, and as a former governor for sure, but most importantly as the mother of a young man who experiences significant disabilities. Ben happens to have cerebral palsy, and he understands everything around him, but is unable to speak or walk or use his fingers to operate a keyboard. So I will say, though, his personality dominates our household. So I approach this from the experiences I've had as Ben's mom, and I can tell you that my family and I understand firsthand the strengths and flaws of our healthcare system. But because of the tireless work of advocates and educators, public officials, champions who came before the Hassan family, our son Ben was able to go to our public school in Exeter, New Hampshire. He's a graduate of Exeter Area High School. Countless children like Ben are able to go to school and participate in their communities because of the Medicaid program. Progress that you've heard from Senator Casey is threatened by Trumpcare. And you're going to hear a couple of examples today of what the Medicaid program means for children who need special services in our schools. But in our family's case, for instance, it wasn't unusual for the school nurse to need to spend significant time on the phone with me or my husband as we navigated Ben's day. Did a seizure he just had mean he needed to come home, or could he stay in school after a little bit of rest in the nurse's office? She had to be up to speed on the various medications Ben took. The physical therapy and occupational therapy he got in his classroom allowed him, for instance, to hold a pen or hold or move a switch on a computer screen so that he could vocalize through the computer. All of those services have a Medicaid component. So here's what we have seen from Trumpcare. We have heard over the last few weeks just how devastating Trumpcare would be to the health of millions of Americans. But let's focus on a couple things. It wouldn't just take us back to life before the Affordable Care Act. That would have been bad enough. But Trumpcare actually makes things even worse than they were because of the drastic changes and cuts to traditional Medicaid. Trumpcare fundamentally alters the very nature of the Medicaid program, putting in place a per capita cap. That's just code for more than $800 billion in cuts over the next decade. Without the support from Medicaid, school districts would be faced with cutting other services, including school nurses, behavioral health services, integrate students with disabilities. It specifically targets special education with a provision that declares that states would no longer have to consider schools to be eligible Medicaid providers. So what that means is states, as they're given this new smaller lump sum of money for Medicaid, could just turn to schools and say, we're not going to send Medicaid money to you anymore in order to make up some of the difference here. That's a huge downshift, by the way, to local school districts and local taxpayers, in addition to being devastating to the lives of the students that Medicaid to schools serves. Medicaid has helped school systems cover costs for special education services and equipment. In New Hampshire, that adds up to about $29 million in our little state of 1.3 million people. So that kind of cut is truly unacceptable. We can't go back to the days where we marginalize or don't assist some of our most vulnerable students. I will stand strong with the people of New Hampshire, with my colleagues here in the Senate, with educators and families across the nation in fighting against this dangerous bill that would pull us.
Very much. We appreciate Senator Hassan bringing the perspective, not only as a member of the Senate, but as a governor and as a mom, and we're grateful for her presence here today, and we're grateful for her work. Yes? The block grant, when you say that out loud, you say it better than I do.
Another thing the block grant will do, it will force people like us into nursing homes, because, you know, it's capped, so if you're on the waiting list, too bad.
Good point.
What about being assessed to get this?
Right, exactly. That's the other issue. There's lots to talk about today, but I want to make sure that as well that we get to folks who will provide some additional personal commentary of their own and tell their own stories. I'm next going to introduce Marbea Tammaro. Marbea is a 31-year veteran occupational therapist. Marbea currently works as the coordinating occupational therapist for the Arlington Public Schools, and we're grateful, Marbea, that you're with us today to give your testimony.
Yay, Marbea!
Good afternoon. My name is Marbea Tammaro. I've been an occupational therapist for over 30 years. I serve as a public school occupational therapist for the past 20 years in Virginia. As Senator Casey said, I coordinate OT and PT services in my county. I've been very privileged to work with many students and families to support students to benefit from their special education and to access and participate fully in school. I want to tell you a little bit about one of the students that I've worked with. T had a stroke at birth. He had weakness on one side of his body. As a preschooler, I worked him to help him learn to feed himself, put his shoes on, and use two hands when playing and doing early academic work. I remember working with him at arrival and dismissal of when he was in preschool, how to manage his backpack, how to open the zipper, how to hold with one hand and deal with the zipper with the other hand. I was lucky enough that when he was a high school student, I got to work with him again. At that time, we supported his transition from using textbooks and binders to electronic organization of his academic work. By this time, he was also identified as having a learning disability and needed to work on his organizational skills. So one of the things we did was look at his electronic files and how did he keep track of his classes and his schoolwork and his assignments, and to support him to do that. Occupational therapists in the public schools provide services at multiple schools, and we work very hard to provide the required services for students with IEPs and 504 plans. IDEA and ESSA does not cover the full cost of providing mandated and required services to students. In our area, it's difficult to find the funding and staffing to cover the mandatory services for students with special needs. Medicaid funding in the schools provides reimbursement to school districts for these expenses. We do not have the resources to fully support students and provide expertise to staff with general education students either. We know we can offer services in this area which may assist a student to develop skills and then perhaps not require special education, but it's hard to have the time and resources to do this. Not having access to Medicaid funding would mean fewer services for all students, both students with disabilities and students in the general education setting. We encourage continued funding of Medicaid in the schools. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marbea. Marbea, thank you very much. Our next presenter today will be Julie Gerhart Rothholz. Julie is from southeastern Pennsylvania, in particular Souderton, Pennsylvania. Julie's 6-year-old son, Evan, has Down syndrome and receives special education services through Medicaid. Since Evan was born, Julie has dedicated her life to helping people with disabilities and is active in several national disability advocacy organizations. Julie?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Julie Gerhart Rothholz, and I am a board member of the ARC Alliance Foundation, an organization that helps individuals with disabilities throughout their lifetime. I am also active in the Pennsylvania Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition. But the most important role I have is clearly being mom, cheerleader, and advocate for my son Evan, a 6-year-old boy who's energetic, tech-savvy, loves looking at YouTube, loves to hang out with his family and friends, and most importantly, loves his kindergarten class where he's fully included alongside his typical peers. Evan has Down syndrome, as the senator mentioned, and he gets his services through medical assistance. It takes a village to make him have success, and this interaction and intervention with him early on will contribute to his success later as an adult. He has occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, behavior services, and a one-on-one aid, along with the help of his teacher and a learning support teacher to ensure that he has success moving through the school system. He loves school, and I look at all of his services that Medicaid provides as something that proposes, supports, and helps independence as he grows older into an adult. Every service that Evan has, every therapy session is a step towards independence, is a step towards making him be the adult that he's going to grow into. What I fear every day as a parent is that I'm going to wake up one day and we're going to be faced with the reality of block grants, reduced funding, and health services are going to become a business decision. Every business decision doesn't necessarily consider the student, the person that needs help as an adult. My thought is, if we're going to talk about business, we should probably talk about investing early to save later, that we should talk about the law of unintended consequences, and that we should talk about how these are people and what we do now can promote their independence as an adult. I think when we look at changes for Medicaid, we need to look at the most we can do to support current level of services or even raise them. We need this to happen for our students so that every day they can progress towards adulthood and to a state of independence. I look at Evan as a child with many possibilities. I see him as a future employee. I see him as a future taxpayer. I see him as a future voter. It's important to preserve his services so that he can make the best decisions and have the best opportunities as an adult. It is my hope that moving forward, all the senators will take kids like Evan, kids with any disability, into account as they make decisions on health care. This little boy is not a business decision, he's a person, and he's a person who is heading towards success. Thank you.
Julie, thanks very much. And before we take questions, I want to make sure that we acknowledge so many people here who brought their own stories and their own arguments as to why we've got to make sure that when the Senate considers this health care bill, they don't do it, don't come to the same conclusions the House did. So I want to thank everyone who was here. And before, just in case people have to leave before we do some questions, I want everyone here to know who's advocating along with us that it may seem that right now that we have but one audience, meaning Republican members of the United States Senate who are either going to consider the House bill and change it or come up with something dramatically different on their own. But they are not the only audience. The American people ultimately are the audience here. We have to make sure that we continue to make the case, especially on Medicaid, along with pre-existing conditions and a lot of other issues that are critically important to the country. But we have to keep making that case, because if this version of the health care bill goes through, this isn't just a dramatic change, an adverse change for millions of Americans, losing health care or losing benefits that they have a right to expect they can depend upon. Losing the guarantee of Medicaid will happen for sure. But I believe this health care bill, if it were to pass, will change American life irrevocably. This isn't just an alteration in policy. This is a radical, destructive change, and the Medicaid parts of this, I think, are Exhibit A, or in the top 2 or 3 priorities. So I want to make sure that people know the consequences and what's at stake here. But I'm grateful you're willing to be with us today to bring your voices, your stories, and your advocacy skills to this effort. But we've got a long way to go to defeat this, and it's just beginning. We're not going to have a vote now for a couple of weeks, and we've got weeks or days at least in May, and we've got a good part of June to make the case, and we have to continue that. So absent any questions from out front, we can adjourn and take questions one by one. But I want to thank everyone for being here today and for lending your voices and your stories. Marbea and Julie and Senator Hassan, we're grateful for your presence here today. Thank you very much.
The poor kids might not be able to do it.
I'm actually impressed. I never in school like getting the